Good morning. This morning I'd like to talk about Felix Varela. He is a Cuban priest and later is considered a patriot. And is a curious fellow, but certainly a fascinating worker. He was born in Havana in 1788. At that time, the Spanish are ruling that. They were ruling Florida as well. And his father is a military fellow who is stationed in Florida. So he grows up a lot in Augusta, Florida. His parents and his grandfather particularly invited him to join the military, but he wasn't for that. He wanted to go into being a priest. And so he goes back to Cuba and goes to a seminary in Havana, and eventually he is ordained a priest. And very shortly thereafter, he's made a professor at the school, and he's teaching philosophy and chemistry and a couple others. And writes a book on philosophy before he's even 30 years old. But what happens then is he gets elected to a group that's sent to Spain. Let's see where the name of that is. It's the Spanish Cortes in Madrid. So this is a major joining of the church and that major meeting, and he brings forth two things. One, and he brings this up to the very leader of the nation, I think it's King Ferdinand, but he brings up the fact that Cuba should be made independent. The other thing he brings up is the fact that the slaves should be eliminated, that they should eliminate slavery. Well, in these days and age, this was considered just outrageous. Spain had just been having some major invasion from France. They were totally against this. So the king decides, well, this guy's got to die. So he sentences him to death. He just gives orders that he's got to be dying. But Felix escapes. And what he does is he ends up, I forgot exactly the first place in between, but he ends up in New York City. And there in New York City as a priest, he's given a small parish of Irish immigrants. And as a part of that, he actually learns how to speak Irish or Gaelic. And he does very well with them, but he does not forget his Cuban roots. And so he started a paper. It's called Habanero. And in this, it was the first Spanish language paper in the United States. And in this, he was very vocal politically, saying that Cuba should be set free from Spain. He continued to push for liberty. He just thought freedom was so important. Matter of fact, he thought that was like the essence of religion. He will say in his book, he has a book called Letters to Elipidio. I'm not sure I pronounced it right, but that's the Greek word for hope. Isn't that interesting? He writes a book on hope. But he says that the way to avoid oppression to liberty is to avoid irreligiosity, which today we might call either like no faith or nuns, and on the other hand, and superstition or fanaticism on the other side, which today we might call extremely conservative on the church side of things. And in his book, he explains the fact that those who have no religion undermine the very moral fabric of society. And that that eruption or that lowering and degradation of that causes us to lose liberty. What he says is once irreligiosity, again, no religion, is spread throughout the social body, it destroys all links of appreciation, and like poison, it corrupts and kills the body. Honor becomes a vain word. Patriotism, a political mask. And virtue a fantasy. And inevitably, this will lead to tyranny. And it's interesting to think that it's through religion that we can have freedom. And yeah, I have to tell you, when I'm talking with the guys in the county jail, and I talk about being free, not free out of their orange outfits and their imprisonment, but free here, they seem to understand that there's something in coming to God that just sets them free. And it's a freedom that no one can control. It's wonderful. So now in New York, being fluent in Spanish, and now having spoken Gaelic to these poor immigrants in Ireland, he is made Vicar General for New York. And at that time, the Diocese of New York is the whole state. The city, obviously, the biggest population in the country, and the whole state. And a Vicar General, I know our Vicar General here in Green Bay, and he works a lot. And so this is a very hard-working operation. And yet at the same time, he continues to argue for Cubans' freedom and for everyone's freedom. And a freedom that only comes in our walking towards God. He is considered the first major Hispanic theologian. Theologian being one who studies God and teaches about God. And it's interesting, there won't be another Hispanic theologian for another 100 years. So we're in I think it's 1837 when he's Vicar General. And by the time 1848 comes around, he's worn out. He's shot. He develops an asthma, and 5 years later, he dies. In the United States, he becomes unknown. Nobody remembers him. I've never heard of his name before. And yet, in Cuba, in 1892, Jose Marti, the father of Cuban independence, visits his tomb. And he called him the Cuban saint. In 1911, the Bishop of St. Augustine requested his remains be returned to Cuba, where he is greatly honored today. Isn't it interesting that if we do true things, we may never be appreciated in our current day, and yet it makes a huge difference. Our words, our intentions are going to God to create liberty. Well, that can have a lasting effect. And Felix has had an effect on us, has had an effect on the freedom that Cuba experienced long before the Cuban Missile Crisis. And a sense of freedom that we all should grab onto. For freedom comes through our loving God and a giving up on ourselves and being so much at peace and free. Amen.